Most people would consider someone earning $250,000 a year wealthy. But what if that person doesn't feel rich? Since the beginning of the economic downturn, we've seen an increased use of the words rich and poor, and we're told repeatedly that the well-off aren't always contributing their fair share. But what does being rich really mean? Joining us now to debate that, in York, UK, via Skype, Richard Wilkinson, co-author of The Spirit Level. In Dallas, Texas, W. Michael Cox, director of the O'Neill Center for Global Markets and Freedom at Southern Methodist University's Cox School of Business. In New York, New York, Catherine Rampell, economics reporter at the New York Times. And back on this side of the border, in Victoria, British Columbia, Paul Somerville, adjunct professor at the Peter Gustafson School of Business at the University of Victoria. And with us here in studio, Joseph Heath, professor of philosophy and director of the Center for Ethics at the University of Toronto. And I want to welcome everybody in 5 different locations in 3 different countries for our discussion today about what makes someone rich. And we're going to start by reading something that was on a website that I will read to you now, and it may set the table for the discussion to come. The rhetoric in Washington about taxes is about millionaires and the super rich. But the relevant dividing line between millionaires and the middle class is pegged at family income of $250,000 a year. That makes me, says the author, super rich and subject to a big tax hike if the president has his way. I'm the president's neighbor in Chicago, but we've never met. I wish we could, because I would introduce him to my family and our lifestyle, one he believes is capable of financing the vast expansion of government he is planning. A quick look at our family budget, which I will happily share with the White House, will show him that, like many Americans, we are just getting by, seeming to be rich. We aren't. Okay, let's pick up on that. If President Obama's definition of rich is wrong, we want to find out how much money it takes to be considered rich today. Richard Wilkinson, why don't you start? What annual income makes you rich today?
Well, it's not a matter of your absolute income, it's how it compares with other people in your society. So if you lived in a much poorer country, people who are less well off than some in the States would be rich. We'd call them rich even though if they lived in the States, we wouldn't call them rich. What does the damage in a society is the scale of income differences between people who are better off and worse off.
Catherine Rampell, I saw some numbers on your blog where some polling was done and people were asked, what do they think rich is? What did you find out?
I mean, I think rich is making $50,000 or $100,000 more than you make, basically. It's sort of a sliding scale. Everyone seems to think that they are middle class, that they are the median earner, even if they're actually at the 95th percentile, and people who make more than they do are rich. And this shows up in poll after poll. There was one Gallup study, for example, where people were asked, should people earning $250,000, they asked people, should upper income people pay higher tax rates? And most people said yes, higher income people should be paying higher tax rates. And when they asked people who earned over $250,000, who were at about the 95th percentile, should upper income people pay higher tax rates, they said yes. But when they said, should you pay higher tax rates, they said no. So a lot of it has to do with this sort of skewed perception of where each American falls within the overall income distribution.
Michael Cox, when Gallup surveyed it, at least the last Gallup survey I saw, the majority of people said it was about $150,000 a year, which made you rich. That would put you in the top 10% of income owners, as opposed to what society talks a lot about these days, which is the top 1%. Where do you peg it at?
I don't peg it at any particular number. I don't think it's relative. I think it should be judged absolute. For example, in the year 1984, this device cost $4,200 and was only affordable by the society's richest people. Today, this device is routinely consumed by some of society's poorest people, yet we call them poor when they ought to be judged as being rich by the standard of the progress we're able to make. You are what you spend, you are what you can consume, and what the data I've looked at, in fact, we published it in the New York Times in an article called You Are What You Spend. What it shows is that rich people only spend, they may make 14 times as much as poor people on a relative basis, but they only spend about 3 times as much because they pay heavy taxes, they contribute to charity, they pay for their kids' college education, and they have many more things that they do with their money which don't ultimately convert to consumption. We're all able to consume a lot more today because of the system which provides for people to be unequal.
Michael, I have a quick follow-up which has nothing to do with the topic of this program, but we all have to know. That big clunky cell phone you just held up in your left hand, you don't still use that and it's not operational, is it?
No, I don't. I think it would be operational from the system standpoint, but not from the hardware standpoint.
Okay, just checking. Paul Somerville in British Columbia, come on in here and tell us where you are on this issue.
Well, a couple of points. I think the first is, like the other speakers, a kind of annual income point doesn't really tell you very much about wealth. When I was on the trading floor at RBC Dominion, we used to talk about 3 numbers that you wanted to aim for: 3 million, 5 million, and 10 million. 10 million was a life of champagne and caviar if you were retired. 5 million was wine and cheese if you were retired, and 3 million was beer and pretzels. So I think actually net worth is a much more important barometer for being rich. But the second thing is that it's not just individual wealth, it's also societal wealth. You know, if you earn, say, $30,000 a year and you're a single mother, but you have access to world-class health care, university education is highly subsidized, there's excellent public transit that you have access to, so your commute to work is, say, 25 minutes, then you may not be rich, but you're living a better lifestyle than someone who earns the same amount of money but doesn't have access to the science of good health, where post-secondary education is very expensive and where public transit is lousy. So I would put it in those rounder terms.
Joseph, you're the guy from the Center for Ethics, so I got a feeling I'm going to have a hard time getting a number out of you as well.
Well, I mean, the blog post that you read from, I think what it reveals is a really important point, which is that there's obviously a big difference between being rich and feeling rich. Because anybody who's in the top 1% income bracket in their society, by any objective measure, is rich. That the term is meaningless if the top 1% are not rich. So clearly he is rich, but he doesn't feel rich, right? And there's an interesting question as to why many of the wealthy don't feel wealthy. So, I mean, that was just a whole series of articles. I mean, there was a series of articles that came out in the wake of the Occupy movement, of basically people who are objectively rich saying, oh, hold on a minute, you know, look at all my expenses, my kids go to private school, I'm not really wealthy. And I think actually there was Hamilton Nolan, Gawker Media, nailed it exactly. He said the fundamental dishonesty of all those articles, but people were saying, you know, objectively this salary looks like a large amount of money, but after I spend it, it's not very much. Completely missing the point that like it's necessary that if you're earning the top 1%, after you've itemized all of your expenses, what you just rattled off are a whole list of things that 99% of people in your society can't afford. And then you go and you say, oh, I'm not rich.
Well,
Okay, I hear somebody trying to get in.
what
Is
does
that
it
Paul?
mean? Now that's Mike and Cox in Dallas.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, 99% of the people in your society. Well, what is your society? Why are we making these comparisons of a person, say, in the United States, only to other people in the United States? If you look at the top 1% of the world's income distribution, just short of half of them live in America. If you make $34,000 or more today in America, you are in the top 1% of the world's income distribution.
You want to come back at that, Joseph?
Well, I mean, the central issue is the tax burden, and since only Americans pay taxes, the question of fairness when it comes to the allocation of the tax burden is an entirely relative thing of how much Americans should pay relative to each other. So the fact that people in Africa are poorer than poor Americans has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not, you know, wealthy university professors living in Hyde Park should be shouldering a greater burden of the tax burden.
Let me follow up with Richard Wilkinson, though, and to Michael's point. If you are what society would consider to be a high-income earning person, but you've got, let's say, 3 or 4 kids, all of whom you're sending off to university, and you give a lot to charity, and at the end of the day, therefore, you're actually not spending a lot on gold faucets for the sinks or international travel, is it possible, Richard Wilkinson, to feel as if you have a high income, but that you're not rich?
I think that it's not simply a matter of what you feel yourself. I remember a journalist in Britain interviewing bankers who were getting these huge bonuses, and she asked them where they thought they came in the income distribution. And they said maybe the top 20 or 30%. In fact, they were the top fraction of 1%, but completely unaware of that. And when journalists say to these people, surely you can't spend all this money, you can't really consume millions of pounds worth of stuff, they say no, but it shows me that I'm better than the next man. And of course, what we should really be talking about is the damage that different scales of income distribution do to a society. The United States, the richest society in the world, bar Norway perhaps, has the worst life expectancy almost of the rich developed countries. It has more people in prison. It has the highest homicide rates. It has the highest obesity rates, and all these things because it is one of the most unequal of the rich societies. And that's really the connection we need to be talking about.
Paul Somerville, can I get you to weigh in, though, on that disconnect? Because you were a guy, as you point out, in a previous lifetime who was a money spinner on a trading floor. How is it that people who can be in the top fraction of 1% of income earners don't feel as if they're rich?
Yeah, well, it's a couple of things. One, the company that you keep, and so I handed out hundreds of thousands of dollars of bonuses to people, and actually got a lot of flack back. And it was because they were comparing themselves to the person, in the next desk. So as human beings, we're much more likely to think about that small community of people that we travel in. So I think that's part of the reason. And then, of course, where those people tend to live. They don't tend to drive and live in the lower income parts of a city. So the kinds of things they have, the kind of cars they drive. In fact, the funny thing is, when I first went to RBC Dominion, I'd gone from an investment bank that was, say, less generous, and I was driving a little Mazda 626, and when I came into the parking lot, some of the assistants who worked for me didn't even want to get in my car. So it's really the question of the company you keep. But I want to pick up on the kind of society that you live in. Again, if you make, say, $1 million a year, but you live in a society where you've got to hire your own security, where you've got to live behind high walls like in Johannesburg, I'm not sure you're going to feel very rich. You're going to probably feel under a lot of pressure to live a life that you want. So I think the broader context of thinking about wealth is very important.
Catherine, I want to bring you in on this, and that is, I want to read something from an organization in Canada called Statistics Canada. It's a bit, I think, like your Bureau of Labor Stats in the United States. And this is from a study where they say there is no agreed upon definition of high income, either in terms of absolute dollar thresholds or as a fixed percentage of the population. While defining poverty exhibits similar difficulties, numerous studies have discussed concepts such as deprivation and straitened circumstances, providing some general support for selecting a threshold below which one is considered to be in low income. No corresponding literature exists for defining high income. And I wonder if in your travels, Catherine Rempel, you've figured out why we seem to know where the low income cutoff is, but we don't know where the high income cutoff is.
I would say it probably has to do with the fact that there's no upper bound on high income, that the very top percentile of rich countries like the United States keeps getting richer and richer and richer. So it's not like you can sort of capture that group in a finite set of upper bound and lower bound. The other issue is that if you look at the income distribution in the United States, it's very skewed toward the top. So the distribution is quite even, like when from the 0th percentile, or the first percentile I should say, to around the 90th percentile, it kind of looks like this, and then it flips up very dramatically. In that if you are at the 50th percentile, someone at the 51st percentile makes only about $1,000 more than you do in household income. If you're at the 99th percentile to the 99.9th percentile, I mean, you're talking about income more than doubling, more than tripling. So this idea of what counts as higher income very much matters where you are in the income distribution, especially when that very high tail of the income distribution keeps on getting higher and higher. It's hard to demarcate where that dividing line should be, just because it varies so much at the very top of the income distribution.
So in your view, Catherine, is the 90th percentile rich?
I mean, in pure objective terms, yes. They're much richer than the 50th percentile. They're richer than the medium. They're richer than the 75th percentile. I mean, this is a tautology at some point. But the idea being that if you're looking within a society, someone who's at the 90th percentile is by definition richer than someone at the 50th percentile. And if you're talking about these terms in the context of the tax burden or other ways that you should be modeling fiscal policy, you really don't have a better way of determining who's rich and who's not rich other than by looking at the income distribution.
Richard Wilkinson, you wanted to follow up?
Yes, I think it's really important to see that this is not about absolute living standards of rich or poor. It's about the differences, and that is because we are sensitive to social status. Bigger material differences create bigger social distances. And we are evolved to be very sensitive to our social status. We get very angry if we feel put down and disrespected, things like that. And we want to be admired and appreciated. It's those things that matter, and the material differences create that perception of bigger or smaller differences in society, whether we are all in the same boat together or whether we are all out for ourselves.
I hear Michael Cox trying to get in and disagree.
The United States.
I'm going to take the completely opposite viewpoint. Because, look, I mean, I was in the Soviet Union. I spent time there. Same thing in Cuba. Those people were all very equal, but they were all equally miserable. As I believe it was Churchill said, the inherent vice of capitalism is the unequal sharing of blessings, but the inherent virtue of socialism is the equal sharing of miseries. And that's the way it was. The only people there who were well off were the people who were at the top of the Communist Party. Same thing is true today in Cuba. Castro's got $250 million. Everybody else makes $30 a month, or in Venezuela or something. What really matters is the absolute and not the relative. The problem with relative is that people have started to engage in too much you versus me scorekeeping. It's not, they should be comparing, just like my mom said, now Mike, don't compare yourself to others. You'll always find somebody who's better off than you, and that'll make you feel bad. But the adult thing to do, the grown-up thing to do, is compare yourself to yourself. Are you doing as well as you could do? Are you seizing all the opportunities that come along to you? Are you making progress in your life? That's healthy. What makes this you versus me scorekeeping is the politicians and the news media who constantly can run a program like Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous and get your attention but make you feel bad. I think it's extremely, look, envy is the root of socialism, and socialism is a failed state.
Let me get Richard Wilkinson to respond, and then Joseph Heath.
Yeah, I'm not talking about socialism, and I think people in some of those countries that Michael has named were unhappy because of lack of freedom of speech and press censorship and lack of democracy, things like that. I've been comparing rich market democracies, countries like Sweden, Norway, the Scandinavian countries, Japan, Britain, the Western European countries, Canada, Australia, United States. And in those countries, you find that almost all the health and social problems are worse in the ones with the bigger income differences. Michael lives in a society where people in the small area, in the poorest areas, have life expectancies on average 12, 15 years shorter than people in the rich areas. And that is wholly unacceptable. If we're talking about human rights, that is an enormous human rights abuse. The worst human rights abuse faced by developed societies.
Joseph Heath wants in.
Oh, I just wanted to say something about the relationship between material inequality and status inequality, because there's a really important dynamic in the economy over the course of the last 100 years that Michael actually sort of adverted to with the example of the cell phone, which is that material goods and the material properties of goods have become much less important simply because manufacturing has made them so plentiful and available. So 100 years ago, if you look at the difference between the rich and the poor, there were significant material differences in what they owned. I mean, poor people wouldn't have furniture and certainly wouldn't have appliances and so forth at the turn of the century. At the turn of the 19th to 20th century. What's happened over the course of the 20th century, of course, is that the poor have gotten access to all of the same material goods that the rich have access to. But what's different is really the positional qualities of the goods. And that is that the things that we aspire now for in our furniture, our appliances, cars, and so forth, are all things that in their very nature evoke a comparison to other people. And therefore we get locked into competitive consumption because, for example, we want something which is stylish. Well, something stylish is not an objectively defined thing. It's all determined by status and class emulation. We want to have a car that has a comfortable ride. But every car has a comfortable ride and is quiet by comparison to the cars 30 years ago.
Sure.
And the big ticket item is real estate, right? We want something which is conveniently located. And we're in downtown Toronto. As people in downtown Toronto know, the cost of a house in downtown Toronto is just a straight up competition with the other people in your income bracket. You sit around a table and you say, I'm going to pay more money because all houses are sold in a bidding war. So it's very obvious that the amount you're paying for your house has almost nothing to do with the house anymore. It has to do with the ability to outbid the other people who are in your income bracket. That's why, for example, the whining about taxes doesn't make a lot of sense because people think about the tax burden as it impacts on them personally. But they don't realize that if the tax burden affects everybody in your income bracket, it's also going to reduce the prices that people are willing to pay. And that's why things like property taxes don't actually significantly affect people's access to real estate.
Michael Cox, I should give you a chance to come back at the last couple of arguments you've heard.
Well, what I want to say is I think we should look at what causes income differences in America. As a first approximation, the income distribution in America is the education distribution. A high school dropout makes about $400 a week, whereas somebody who gets a medical degree and decides to become a doctor makes $200. That's the $250,000 person is your average doctor. Now some doctors make $1 million if they're a neurological surgeon. Do I want to have a system where everybody makes the same amount of money and a person who is a hotel maid in the Soviet Union makes the same amount as a doctor? What kind of medical services do you think you'll have? So if you look at the different income strata from professional degree, PhD, master's, bachelor's, less than a college degree but no college degree, all the way down to a junior high dropout, that's where you find that the most income distribution in America comes from is the education distribution.
Okay, but just to be fair, I don't think I've heard anybody on the program today arguing that a neurosurgeon ought to be paid the same as a chambermaid at a hotel. No one's saying let's go back to the Soviet Union style of governance today.
But what people are insinuating is that you can have both. Is that you can have the equality and still have the dynamic progress in society. I don't agree with that. A lot of the progress comes from the inequality.
Paul Somerville, can you come in on that?
Yeah, well, the question then is, how do you create a society so that at birth you are doing everything you can to give everyone as equal a shot as is possible, that you can end up earning those big dollars, that you can make yourself rich. And of course, one of the indictments of the United States is that despite its wealth, it in fact is, among the rich countries, has the least amount of intergenerational mobility. So if you're born in the top 10% or if you're born in the bottom 10% in the United States of America, you're more likely to die there than almost any other developed country. And the reason is because of the high cost and poor quality of education. Primary and high school education, America has systematically underinvested. And the high cost of getting a university degree. So the point is how do you create a society that is dynamic in creating wealth and becoming rich? And I think you do that by investing in public goods like access to health, equality in front of the law, education, and public transit. To me, that's the really most important point, more important than just trying to define what rich is.
Okay, let me follow up with Catherine, though, in this respect. And I don't mean to be pedantic about this, Catherine, but I am trying to get a sense about what number makes sense. And to pick up on Paul's argument, let's say you live in the United States today. Let's say you live in New York City, where you are, where you have the advantages of a good public transit system and a city that is certainly more than 25 years ago relatively safe today. All of those things that make up whatever New York is today. According to Barack Obama, when he started off, not where he ended up, but where he started off, $250,000 annual income was, in his view, rich and therefore deserved to be taxed more heavily. What do the facts say, or what does your reporting tell you about that number?
Certainly a lot of people who live in New York City would say I earn $250,000 and my household does, and we do not count as rich because look at our neighbors down the street who earn millions of dollars. You know, clearly they live a much better lifestyle than I do. Costs are very high in New York. Housing in particular is very expensive. Food is very expensive. Yes, we have a very good public transit system, but we have a lot of very high costs of living. But then again, you know, if you look objectively, even if you adjust for the cost of living, people in New York are very high income and enjoy a much better quality of life for a lot of these reasons that we've been discussing. So I think a lot of it has to do with again, sort of a skewed frame of reference that people in higher income areas like New York, like DC, areas that are very influential in this discussion of who counts as rich and therefore who should bear more of the tax burden in the United States or whose taxes should go up. They live in these very high cost areas and have perhaps a wrong frame of reference for what the overall picture of the United States looks like. So I don't know that you could put a specific number on it, who counts as rich. I mean, certainly people in New York would feel very differently from people in lower cost areas like Kansas, where, you know, you don't have the same big cities with high costs and that sort of thing. But if you're just looking objectively at the data, at the overall income distribution in the United States, you would see that $250,000 objectively counts as higher income, as rich, regardless of where you live.
Michael Cox, in terms of feeling rich, is there really that much of a difference between making $250,000 a year, say, and $500,000 a year?
I doubt it, especially with the added tax burden that comes there. And what people would do with that extra $250,000, you know, 40% plus of it is going to go, more than that, 45 is going to go to the government of that added amount. Plus, you're more likely to engage in things like buying a little, be able to afford insurance for yourself. You know, and there's so many uses of money which don't directly contribute to current consumption. So I seriously doubt it. I'm going to come back to the argument the person made about the public sector. I think that's the important thing here. America's middle class seems to have kind of gotten hollowed out a little bit, and people have moved to the two ends. But the main reason that has happened, in my opinion, is a failure of America's school system at the K through 12 level to provide people with adequate education that they could earn middle class wages. Yesterday, America had a middle class that was built to the industrial age, when if you went to a factory, some industrial age capitalist would stick some machinery and equipment in your hand, and you could earn middle class wages with those. But those jobs have gone, say, to China and so on now, and America hasn't replaced those with having people who have a middle class level of intellectual capital, not physical capital. And that middle class intellectual capital should be provided between ages 5, K, and 18 by our public schools, but our public schools are failing to do that. So because of the failure of the public schools, we've had a hollowing out of the middle class, and people either have a good education or they're a high school dropout. Now that's an extreme comparison, I know, it's not that bad, but it has become more so that way than we really want.
Joseph Heath wants to comment on that.
Oh, I was just going to say, there are some really interesting differences between the United States and Canada in this respect. And you could see it actually showing up in those articles that people were writing about, I'm so rich, but I don't feel rich. And the American ones, there were some items that showed up consistently in the American ones that actually were quite noticeably absent in the Canadian ones. So some of the ones that showed up really consistently in the American ones were, first of all, having to have 2 cars. Secondly, the cost of your house. Thirdly, having to send your kids to private school. Fourthly, medical expenses. Fifth, saving for your kids' college education. It was very interesting that a lot of those were absent in the Canadian ones. And that is that, Americans have made a lot of choices collectively. And one of the choices they've made is to constrain public expenditure on a variety of different things. And that means fewer public universities. It means poorer quality public schools at the K-12 level. It means less public transit, so you're more likely to need a car. It means a hugely expensive mortgage interest tax break that drives up the cost of real estate and so on and so forth. So the Canadian ones were actually a lot less impressive because in Canada, you barely have to save for your kids' college education. Most people can send their kids to the public school, and it's not a frightening place, and so forth. A lot of people have access to public transit in cities, and therefore don't have to have a second car, and so forth. So the Canadian lists actually were often less impressive. The rich people were like, I spend $1,000 a month on wine. and therefore I'm not rich, and things like that. But I think it is important to recognize that Canada and the United States have made very, very different choices with respect to what goods and services are going to be provided by the public sector. And in an American context, the decision is clearly that it's going to burden individuals more heavily.
Well, let me continue along that path there by comparing Canada to the United States. And actually, I'm going to get the guy from the UK to comment on this. Neither a Canadian nor an American. I want to hear what Richard Wilkinson has to say about comparing these numbers. We're going to present some numbers here comparing the top 10% in the United States versus the top 10% in Canada, and then get some analysis. For example, control room, I'm on the bottom of page 4. In the United States, the top 10% make on average $107,000 plus a year. The top 1%, north of $335,000 a year. The top 0.1% were up over $1.3 million, and the top 0.01% were almost at $6 million in annual income. Compare to Canada, where the top 10% is only making $63,000 a year on average. The top 1%, it's not at $335, you're at $169 to $404. The top 0.1%, you got $621,000 versus $1.4 million. These numbers are obviously significantly lower than in the United States. And Richard Wilkinson, I just wonder what you infer from those differences.
Well, I think they're very important, and I think they are the reason why Canada has higher life expectancy, why it has lower homicide rates, why it has better educational performance measured in terms of kids' maths and literacy scores, why it has higher social mobility than the United States. People have known for hundreds of years, since before the French Revolution, that inequality is divisive and socially corrosive. Social cohesion is damaged, participation in community life is weakened by bigger income differences. People trust each other less. And many studies have looked at American states, the amount of inequality in each American state, and added on the Canadian provinces. And you can see very clearly that it's inequality that is doing the damage, and the explanation of why some American states do better than others, and why Canadian provinces do better than most of the American states.
Okay, we should let our American friends have their equal time on this. Catherine Rampell, do you take the same inferences from those numbers?
I think there's a lot of debate about what role inequality has in a country's growth rate. And what exactly we mean by inequality. Are we talking about inequality of opportunity, inequality of outcome, and that sort of thing? A lot of the issues we've discussed so far. I mean, one thing that I would be interested to know with regard to the numbers that you just mentioned in the United States versus Canada is those are pre-transfer, right? Those numbers do not include whatever kinds of social services people get from the government, right? So they don't include in-kind transfers like health insurance.
I would think that's right, yes.
Right. So, I mean, I would wonder what those numbers would look like if you included the other types of sort of social safety net and welfare goods that Canadians enjoy that Americans don't. You know, for example, if you're at the top 10th percentile in Canada versus in the United States, you probably have to pay for a much larger share of your health expenditures than in Canada. So when you include all of those kind of factors that that are sort of basic necessities, do the numbers even out a bit? I don't know. I would imagine that they do, just because my impression is that Canada has a much stronger social safety net than the United States does. But I would be very interested to see what those numbers look like when you considered the types of things that factor into people's quality of life that are not captured.
Michael Cox, what do you infer from those numbers?
I infer that the United States has a much more dynamic society, which probably rewards people a lot more heavily if they engage in an activity like create a new product. If you look at what the rich people do for society, it's an enormous what they do to bring new products to market. They bring new products to market. They start businesses. They hire people, millions of jobs created by people who have small businesses. They save their money, invest in other companies to make those companies grow. And what I'm saying here is that I would expect you to see a lot of Americans who have really gotten wealthy are the ones who've started these big, Facebook, big U.S. companies, which are marketed worldwide, and so they've in a sense hit the lottery, the jackpot of the global consumption group, and there's a lot of that in this country. It's one great thing about America. Look at Oprah Winfrey. She sells her program in countries all over the world, and so she cleans up because of that.
Okay, understood. Let me, I want to go now, control room, to the bottom of page 5 and read this from Jeffrey Jones of the Gallup organization, which came out, I guess a couple of years ago. And here's what Gallup found. They found that those earning below $50,000 a year typically said they would need to earn $100,000 or more in annual income to be rich. Those at or above that level typically report that they would need to earn $200,000 a year to be rich, which expands to $250,000 among those well above the U.S. median income, $75,000 or more in annual household income. The poll also finds higher estimates of the annual income needed to be rich among men than among women. Estimates also are higher for younger versus older Americans, and college graduates versus college non-graduates. The typical parent of minor children believes he or she would need to make more money to be rich than does the typical American without minor children. Additionally, urban and suburban residents believe they would need more to be rich than do those residing in towns or rural areas. Joseph, you want to help us understand why those distinctions?
I mean, I would just say it's a reflection of the fact that it's all relative. And so people, one of the big misunderstandings about competitive consumption is that people often think that in order to be engaged in competitive consumption, you have to be mentally thinking about other people and competing with them actively, or that you need to be buying things sort of because they're expensive.
Not the case?
Absolutely not the case. Most of typically the way in which competitive consumption happens is that concerns about relative position and status affect and determine people's taste. And then people go out and they buy things that are simply in their taste. Right? So, not to pick on the blogger that you mentioned at the very beginning, but one of the reasons why he can't get very far in his $250,000 was that he decided to renovate a heritage home in Hyde Park. That's why he lives right near Barack Obama.
In Chicago.
Right? Yeah, and so that is an expression of a particular kind of taste that many university professors have, but it's an extremely expensive taste. Now, he's not thinking of that as competitive consumption, but of course it is. So I, being a university professor in a similar income bracket, have exactly the same taste as him because we have the same status aspirations. And so I also live in a nice little heritage home, which is walking distance to where I work. Now, it's presented as though it's a sort of virtuous consumption choice, but it's competitive consumption. So a while ago, I did the math on how much I was actually paying for the privilege of walking to work. And so I did a back of the envelope calculation on if I were just to move further away with the exact same house and drive to work, how much money I could save. And my back of the envelope calculation was that it was costing me about $100 per day for the privilege of walking to work. Right? So that's extremely expensive. But of course, so if I were to decide to move out to the suburbs and buy a Ferrari and show up at work, whatever, pull into the parking lot in a red Ferrari, everyone would be like, oh, Heath, consumption, consumerism, blah, 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 right?
But in fact, it's less.
But in fact, I'd be saving money, right? The most ostentatious lifestyle is that, the little tree-lined neighborhood and the heritage home and so on and so forth.
Okay, somebody's trying to get in there. Who's trying to get in?
Well, maybe I live in Victoria because I'm not into competitive consumption, but we've talked a little bit about the social context about thinking about wealth, but maybe ask the question differently. Ask someone, if you're making, say, $150,000 a year, do you feel rich? But you have no pension. You don't have a defined pension plan. But then ask that question to a teacher or a fire person or a police person or a postie and say, well, do you feel rich? And they're making, I don't know, $45,000 a year. But then when you explain to them that average life expectancy in Canada is about 80 years, and if you reach 65 healthy, you're going to live to 90. And then you point out that with the defined pension plan indexed to inflation, that at current interest rates, in order to fund that pension plan, they're probably worth about $6, $7, or $8 million. So you really got to think. You got to really kind of contextualize that conversation. So we've talked about the social side, but there's also that individual context. And there's a lot of people who may not consider themselves rich until they do the math around their pension plans, and that really applies to the public sector. And I think that's actually why there's a lot of angst right now in people's lives, particularly with rising rising life expectancy around wealth, because people are scratching their heads and they're going, wow, I'm going to live to 85 or 90, or they see their parents live that long, and then they realize, I've only saved, $1 million, and maybe my house is worth $500,000, and I have no pension. I'm going to run out of money. So there's a divide that's occurring in our society because of rising life expectancies, and the difference between people who have defined pension plans indexed to inflation and those that don't.
I did want to get Richard Wilkinson, though, to comment on that Gallup information that I just put out before, and I presume some of it is common sense, but you know, why men versus women feeling they need to be more? Why do, let me try this again. Why do men feel they need to earn more than women feel they need to earn to feel rich? Why do urban people feel they need to earn more versus rural people, etc.? Help us with that, if you would.
Well, I'd say, as Joseph did, that all these things are relative, where you are in relation to other people. And if we're honest, you know, it isn't about whether we have the one or other kind of phone that Michael showed us early in this program. It's about where we are in relation to other people. It's about feelings of superiority and inferiority. And if you're really going to understand what inequality does to a society, and to the quality of community life and how much people feel they can trust each other, we have to understand how material differences drive the social status differences. If you want to get rid of class divisions or reduce class divisions, to increase social mobility, all sorts of those kinds of things, you have to reduce the material differences between us. And that doesn't mean going to communism. That's just a sort of scaremongering thing that people like Michael put up, which frighten them themselves. So they aren't prepared to look at the data from other countries. The Scandinavian countries are more democratic than the United States, and their economic growth has been just as great. The quality of life is higher on all sorts of different measures. Until people like Michael stop scaring themselves by thinking that if you have smaller differences, you go back to the Soviet Union, which is just a stupid idea.
You're scaring me now.
You can't see really how to get the best of both worlds.
Okay.
We want a liberal market
you know,
democracy.
Equal sign for Dallas
this
here.
silly.
We need smaller differences between us.
Go ahead, Michael.
Well, I know you need to come down out of your ivory tower, academic intellectual tower, into the real world here. People are competitive, and they will always be competitive. What I'm hearing is kind of a childish statement that somewhere along the way a race was won and a race was run. And we're going to run races in life our whole life. From the time we were in kindergarten, we run races. Because some child won, another one felt bad that he did not win. Therefore, we should stop having races, because when somebody wins a race, these other people feel bad. And so we're going to stop racing. We're going to stop all competitions. We're going to stop all efforts for humans to become better, which result in people becoming unequal. Now, when you do that, you've stopped all progress, and you're going to get exactly to like what my friend Natalie from the Ukraine told me. She says, I spend three parts of my life are spent equally. One part with my family, one part working, and one part standing in line waiting for society to deliver me some goods and services, because nobody wants to work because you can't win the race.
Richard Wilkinson, you want to come back?
You must look at America's past. In the 1970s, CEOs of the big companies, the top 300 companies, got 25 times more than the average production worker. By the early 2000s, they were getting 200, 300, 400 times as much. You were a more equal society, and you did better in all sorts of ways when you were a more equal society. Your position has slipped.
First of all,
the best of American capitalism was in the 60s and 70s when you were a more equal society.
well, first of all, Richard, you've entire time during the program. Sorry?
Michael, let me give you a chance to respond, and then we'll go on.
All I'm just going to say is that you're again implying that there's something inherently wrong with inequality, and there's not, especially when you want to undo that inequality through democracy. Look, if 51 out of 100 person were to go take guns, you rank everybody from the richest to the poorest person and have the bottom 51 go steal the money from the other 49 with a gun, we'd throw them in jail. But if you let them do that through democracy, that doesn't make it morally right. It makes it theft still nonetheless, when a group of people who don't feel like they're making as much as others can use democracy to take from others. That's what scares me. That's where you're scaring me. You think that democracy is a legitimate vehicle for taking from others.
Your modern levels of inequality are a lack of democracy. the top incomes that have taken off to such extraordinary levels reflect a lack of any kind of accountability. To deal with this, we must make people more accountable, have more employees on boards, on remuneration boards of companies, make companies more democratic. So this kind of extraordinarily undemocratic appropriation of wealth doesn't happen.
I'm going to get Paul Somerville to come in and referee this. Go ahead, Paul.
Well, so here's the challenge for any successful social democracy. There's really the twin virtues of any successful social democracy are unequal outcomes. Unequal outcomes are wonderful. We all want our kids to win a gold medal. It's wonderful to get a bonus for $1 million. But the point is, how do you tax and regulate the economy so that there is equality of opportunity, so that everyone has, as best as you can manage. It's an uneven process because we're all born with different skills and different parents and live in different neighborhoods. But how do we embrace inequality of outcome with equality of opportunity? That's the challenge. And I think in societies where people generally feel that they have the tools to have a shot at those unequal outcomes, those are the societies that are going to be the healthiest, and they're the ones that are going to be the most successful, and where the issue of richness really isn't around too much.
Catherine Rempel, let me try this with you. If nobody can quite agree on what constitutes a rich person, in your reporting, what do people tell you, aside from income, other things, make them feel rich?
Well, I mean, the big elephant in the room that we haven't mentioned when we've been talking about being rich or being wealthy is wealth itself. That is not income, but how much you've stockpiled. And it's an interesting concept that hasn't made it into a lot of the debates in the United States about who counts as rich and who doesn't. We talk about people earning above a certain amount per year, but we don't think about how much they've inherited, for example, how much they've accumulated over the years, because tax rates on, particularly on wealth, have been quite low, or at least returns from wealth. So I think that's one indicator that probably needs to be a bigger part of the discussion, at least if we're talking about these questions of social class and mobility and things like that. The United States so far has not really approached anything resembling a wealth tax on the living anyway. On a federal level, we do have property taxes at the state and local levels, which are in a way wealth taxes. But it's interesting to me that this particular measure of class differences in society has not gotten a lot of attention. I mean, one example would be that I've heard from readers who have criticized Warren Buffett, who has been considered this very progressive figure amongst the billionaires of the world, for advocating what has been called the Buffett Rule, the idea that his secretary should not be paying a higher share of her income in taxes than he does, because he pays a very low tax rate, given that most of his income comes from capital gains. But the criticism that I've heard is, well, that's really a distraction from what we should be talking about, which is the fact that people like Warren Buffett have accumulated so much wealth over the years as a result of low tax rates, so that if you actually implement something resembling the Buffett Rule now, that's not going to rectify these great divides in wealth accumulation that have already taken place over many years. So that's one indicator that we could be talking about when we think about inequality, and that again I hear from occasional readers and other pundits about, but that hasn't taken a major role in the discussions.
Let me ask Joseph Heath to follow up on that. Do you, on that list of things besides whatever it is, $200,000, $250,000, $500,000 of annual income, what else is on the list that makes people feel as if they are wealthy?
Well, I mean, it is true that one of the things that's really changed in the wealthy, that is defined by income, is where that income comes from. And so if you go back 100 years ago to the Gilded Age, then a lot of the really, really high incomes were actually due to inherited wealth. And one of the big changes, which may be a salutary development, is a lot of the super, super wealthy are all earning very, very high incomes, and inherited wealth is actually less important than it used to be. And so there've been a lot of changes in the way in which we think about these things, and also like what the wealthy spend their money on has also dramatically changed. I think there's been a huge shift away from material towards competitive consumption. I think that's part of the dynamics and so on.
Well, that's what I wanted to understand. The more flat screen TVs you have, the better car you drive, the more bells and whistles and iPhones and these kinds of things. Are these the tools of a wealthy person nowadays?
Absolutely, and I think it's therefore important to realize that because of that shift in consumption, people are always going to feel. Look, 100 years ago, if you I mean, there are a lot of economists, you know, and not just Marx, but a lot of really kind of like flinty-eyed economists thought that in the 20s, they look at the rate of growth and they say, wow, if we keep growing like this for 100 years, it is going to be inconceivable that there will be any more class or distributive conflict in our society. Because people are going to be wealthy beyond the dreams of avarice. And therefore, we're going to enter what they called post-scarcity conditions. And I think actually one of probably the biggest surprise in the last 100 years, in social science generally, and economics in particular, is that you can quintuple the wealth of a population and have it make no difference whatsoever on people's experienced level of well-being or happiness. That is, the wealthy fight just as vociferously against any tiny increase in their income taxes now when they're 5, 10, 15, 20 times wealthier than they used to be 100 years ago.
You find that depressing?
It's incredibly depressing. Right? I mean, the core premise of a lot of socialist thought in 100 years ago was that people were going to get less possessive as they became wealthier. And that much, I think we clearly understand, is not true.
Let me get Paul Somerville to weigh in on this. And Paul, I ask you this question because you are a guy with some partisan political experience. You've run recently for the Liberal Party of Canada. And I wonder whether the question of who is rich and who is poor, how significant that question has become to those who are in decision-making capacities in our political world.
Well, I did run in a by-election late last year, and what was very interesting was that over the course of 35 days, at least here in Victoria, that we never got a question about the economy. Any of the candidates, we were in a number of public forum, we never got a question about how do you create wealth. In the end, 75% of the vote went to the two political parties that are suspicious of wealth. And in some cases, very hostile to it.
That would be the NDP and the Greens, you say?
That's correct. That's correct. In the case of the Green candidate, we were asked about coal exports to China, and he said, well, we should just ban them. And of course, that would mean throwing 4,000 people out of work and shutting down a $7 billion industry. So there was this tremendous disconnect between what wealth is and how an economy actually works, which no one seemed to really want to ask any questions about. And then how do you go about and spend public money? And everyone was lined up at the trough. But when we actually look at it hard, we have to think very carefully about how do we create a competitive economy that creates unequal outcomes so we have sustainable revenues to create equality of opportunity, justice, equality in front of the law, access to the science of good health, world-class education outcomes, and I think world-class public transit. There's a presumption about those things, but no one really wants to think hard about the wealth question, partly because I think people are very embarrassed to talk about wealth, and a lot of people are afraid to show their lack of understanding about how economies really work. And I think it's a shame. I think one of the things that didn't happen in the by-election last year, and I didn't see any evidence in the other three, is that the business community actually gets involved and gets candidates in public forum and asks them questions about how they think about the economy. We need a really constant and ongoing conversation about wealth, how important it is, embracing unequal outcomes, but in a way that are taxed and regulated so that you have constant revenue to fund equality of opportunity.
Okay, Richard Wilkinson, you'll forgive this. I'm down to my last 30 seconds here, but I do want you to weigh in on this question. In the UK experience, the question of who is rich and who is poor and whether that has exercised the political decision-making apparatus of your country.
Yes, the issue of income differences and wealth differences has become increasingly important. A number of our big cities, about 8 of them, have set up what they call fairness commissions. The local governments have set up fairness commissions to see how income differences locally can be reduced to make their cities a better place to live in all sorts of different ways, particularly social cohesion and people's feeling of being able to trust each other and so on.
Very good.
It's come onto the political agenda. All of the 3 major parties talk about whether the cuts are fair and so on. There's a lot of argument about that, and beginnings of movements amongst the very wealthy to try and tackle these income differences, and a movement against tax avoidance and against the tax havens. Although it's still a minority, it's gathering pace and strength.
We're going to give our friend from the motherland the last word on tonight's program. Richard Wilkinson from the UK, his book, The Spirit Level, Why Equality is Better for Everybody has been a massive bestseller, and we thank you for joining us on the program tonight from York. W. Michael Cox down in Dallas, Texas from Southern Methodist University. Catherine Rampell from the New York Times in our New York City bureau. Paul Somerville in Victoria, British Columbia, the Center for Global Studies at the UVic, and Joseph Heath, the Director of the Center for Ethics at the U of T. Thanks all of you for joining us tonight from 5 different locations for this discussion.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.